Hello, everybody, and welcome to Appendix Next, What to Read When You're Done Reading Appendix N. This is our seminar here tonight. We are going to talk a little bit about, after you've worked your way through the famed Appendix N, some other writers, contemporary and preceding the authors on the Appendix N list. And for our esteemed panel here tonight, we have me. I'm Michael Curtis. I'm the Director of Product Development for Dungeon Crawl Classics. And I guess we'll go down from this guy all the way at the end here on the left. And
cool. My name is Joseph Goodman. I'm the publisher at Goodman Games, and I love to read.
I'm Howard Andrew Jones. I'm the editor of Tales from the Magician's Skull, and yeah.
And he's tired.
And I'm really tired. I also write a lot of sword and sorcery, and I also am a big fan of pulp history and like that. Yeah.
And I'm Bob Brinkman. I write for Goodman Games, and I'm a co-host of the Sanctum Sanctorum podcast, where we talk about Appendix N.
so if you are watching this or if you're attending the seminar here in person, we assume that you have some familiarity with what Appendix N is. But to quick sum that up, in case you're unaware, Appendix N is famously the list of authors and works that Gary Gygax said influenced his development of Dungeons and Dragons back in the early 1970s. And he famously put those together in the Dungeon Master's Guide and labeled it under Appendix N. So some time ago, Joseph Goodman was working on a new variation of the Dungeon Crawl Classics line, and that evolved into its own game. So you want to explain briefly what the role of Appendix N came in that was?
Yeah, Gygax read the books in Appendix N, which heavily influenced the creation of D&D. So what I did, and others helped me on this, is I went back and reread those books and then applied what you might call modern game design principles to it, and in a certain sense recreated D&D using modern principles with direct application to the inspirations of Appendix N, and that became Dungeon Crawl Classics role-playing game.
So this seminar is basically designed to, after you've kind of worked your way through Appendix N, or you're at least familiar with some of those titles, if you're looking to expand, this is kind of the advanced course. If Appendix N is, Sword and Sorcery 101, this is 201. So we're going to draw some names that were kind of either influenced the writers who were on Appendix N or who were contemporaries of the authors that Gygax was influenced by. But of course, this is early 1970s. Gary Gygax didn't have Amazon. He could say, "Oh, that sounds like something interesting," and have that on his front doorstep. And he was limited to whatever was in print at that time. Whatever he'd get on the spinner rack at the local drugstore or at the library. So obviously, there was a lot more. The field of sword and sorcery was much broader, but Gary just didn't have access to that. So some of the names are basically should have been on Appendix N, but are not, and other ones were most likely overlooked. I will be first. Some of the names that I've brought to the table are not the greatest, but at least from a game design point, or at least something to steal from, it's great because they are overlooked. Because and it's always better to steal from something that nobody's going to notice you're stealing from. So, until you try to publish that professionally. Yes. So this will work for your home game. So I kind of want to go back and I want to begin with a name which is very influential, not only on some of the Appendix N authors, but on modern fantasy itself. And so that name is George Mcdonald. And George Mcdonald was a Scottish writer, and he most famously, he's basically known probably for about 3 different works. And the ones I want to talk about are Phantastes. There's the story of the Princess and the Goblin, and a short story he wrote called The Golden Key. And these are all very much in the fairy tale sort of genre. This is before we kind of have a lot of expectations about modern fantasy and stuff. So they are, in a lot of ways, they're very childlike, but they are also very otherworldly. They're not quite what Tolkien called secondary world, but it is in elaborations on folktale and developing them more and telling a cohesive story with them. And Phantastes is about the protagonist goes to bed one night and he kind of wakes up in the fairy realm. Literally, his bedroom has been infected by the other world, and he begins wandering through this kind of otherworldly landscape, trying to find his way back. And I think Dunsany was definitely influenced by it because there's a lot of that feeling on that. With Mcdonald, of course, he was writing in the late 1800s, and so it's not. If you're coming to it with modern sensibilities, you might find the writing, a little tough in places, but it is by all means not, insurmountable, especially if you just go along with it. And the advantage of things like I believe you can get Fantasties from like the Gutenberg project. So if it's something you want to check it out, the only thing it's going to miss is some of the original woodcuts that have it.
And it's spelled with a PH.
Yes, P-H-A-N-T-S-E-S, yeah, T-A-S-T-E-S, yes. So that is so that's one of his. The other work that he's probably most famous for is The Princess and the Goblin. And when you can imagine with a title like that, that is very much in the fairy tale vein. Yeah, and I think it's a short story. Voice in the Night, I think, is one of that's one of the ones that was kind of what they call the Sargasso Sea kind of cycle.
Yes.
But that was actually that one was adapted as a Japanese horror movie called Mantango. Which was redone as a Attack of the Mushroom People, and it's really trippy. It's if you've never seen Mantango, I heartily recommend it because it's a group of travelers get shipwrecked on this island. The only thing that's on the island is fungus, and they start realizing they're not the first person on the island, and it's got some great special basically it's a Japanese monster movie, so there's basically big mushroom costumes.
Rubber mushrooms.
Yeah. So.
Well, and the other thing I like about House on the Borderland, some folks really aren't necessarily comfortable with going back to old prose, and the further back you go, the more difficult it can be just to sort of get linked into something. But since House on the Borderland is told in a narrative style, there are some wonderful audio versions of it as well, and it really carries that feeling. If you've got a good narrator in a story that's narration, it also throws a really nice hook for it.
And speaking of difficult to read, I think that's a perfect segue into the last, kind of pre-Appendix N author I wanted to talk about, and that would be William Morris, not to be confused with the Talon Agency. But William Morris was an English writer, and to say he was a medievalist is an understatement. William Morris believed that human civilization apexed during the Middle Ages, and it's been all downhill ever since. So he was a famous socialist. He made his living basically making tapestries and fabrics the way they did during the Middle Ages, and they became very, very popular amongst like kind of the nouveau riche, and that gave him plenty of time to write. And some of the works that he did are the two of the ones that I enjoy the most are both called The House of the Wolfens and The Roots of the Mountain. And these both also inspired Tolkien. And House of the Wolfens, it's kind of like Northern European folklore, or like a saga. It's a story about, basically it takes place in amongst the Germanic tribes, and the Romans are invading, so it's about all the tribes kind of gathering together under their banners, and there's a set of cursed chainmail, and there's kind of I believe they call it the wood wife, who is like this Valkyrie figure who brings the chainmail, and she has like her husband who is the warlord, and there's this whole big deal. It's like, don't worry, this armor will protect you from all harm, but he's like, but then if I wear the things that will protect me from all harm, there's no glory, and so like, does he wear it, does he not? It can be confusing because they refer to the Romans as Welsh the entire time, because there's the old term, of course, it maybe mean foreigner, but I'm wondering, like, what are the Welsh doing in Germany? The first time reading, like, what are the Welsh doing in Germany hanging out with the Romans, And The Roots of the Mountain, I always call kind of like the unofficial sequel to The House of the Wolfens. That takes place, on this mountaintop, and there is it's a collection of kind of this kind of Dark Ages society, and there's people who live just out a little bit further up the mountain, and are they kind of fairy-esque? Are they elves? Are they some sort of spirit? What's going on happening with them? And kind of the interplay between the two cultures. And it's again another thing, especially if you're looking to do something which is more of the foothold in less straight fantasy and more of kind of almost historical fiction, which I figured is a perfect way to get into that. But William Morris also, his most favorite book is a book called The Wood Beyond the World, and it's a great book, and it's a very important footnote in fantasy. It is also, he wrote it as basically, if a fantasy novel is written in medieval times, so it is very hard. It's a very hard slog to read. You
It's
know,
like Blazing World hard.
like it is very much So there's stuff to be get from it if you can slog through it. But I personally I enjoy House of the Wolfens and Roots of the Mountain myself. But historical kind of fiction, which is.
Actually, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go
Well,
ahead.
on this subject of inspiring Appendix N, some of the stuff you guys said made me think of Algernon Blackwood.
Yeah.
He's pretty cool. It's been like a year since I read some of his works, but he wrote The Wendigo, as I recall, and The Willows.
The Willows, yes.
Yeah, those are great.
That's
Yeah.
another one that Lovecraft loved. He
Yeah.
considered that one of the scariest stories he ever read in his life.
Yeah, and they're both great. The Willows is a weird story. It's basically about, I think it's 2 or 3 folks who get kind of shipwrecked on a little, not even shipwrecked, river wrecked on a little island in the river. And it's kind of a sandbank, and they sort of camp out while they're fixing their boat, as I recall, and they go to bed, and they wake up, and a lot of the sand's been washed away, and then there's these weird funnel-like imprints in the sand that we think maybe come from an extra-dimensional monster, or maybe just erosion. You're not really sure, and the longer it goes on, you're terrified because it appears that the island is eroding, and it's not all natural. There's something after them. And it's really quite creepy because you really don't ever, I felt like I don't ever know exactly what the nemesis is, you know? Everybody's unclear as to what's happening, including the reader, but he does it in a very captivating
I think that's probably what Lovecraft loved the most about it, because it's very unexplained. It's just like I'm not even sure what I read.
It's indescribable because you never see it.
Yeah, you never see it. You don't quite know what's happening. You just know they're scared they're going to get washed away because they can't fix their boat, and the sandbar they're on is like slowly washing away due to unexplained causes. It's creepy and good.
Well, and environmental horror is fantastic. I mean, if
Yeah.
you want to talk about game design, things that make the world around you tense and fearful and dangerous is just as, if not more important than anything else you're putting in there. You need to have an emotional link,
Yeah.
and that really, it really does it very well.
Actually, that term, environmental horror. I mean, the other story that I recall from him was The Wendigo, which is set in, there's this word for this, but like these sparse Canadian forests, which I don't think I've ever visited, but
The middle of nowhere, I think, is the phrase you're looking
yeah,
for.
yeah, my impression was it's these forests that are sort of growing in almost like a swamp-like area, but not quite the Florida swamp, but more like these northern Canada tall trees, endless horizons of nothingness except vegetation, and it's all muck and swamp and mud. And these fellows, again, I believe they get lost. And then the Wendigo, which again, you're never quite sure what it is, but some sort of pseudo Sasquatch who also flies. And remember, he like burns your feet off. Do you guys remember this part?
Been too long.
There's this weird part where I think he burns your feet off. He carries you up and like your feet get burned or something like that. But again, you're just afraid because there's nowhere to go in this wilderness. You don't know how far it is until you get to a city or civilization and they get lost, and then this strange creature appears at night and like picks you up and carries you away and then leaves you there. Environmental horror is perfect.
Yeah,
'cause
the
you don't know
sense of
what's in this
desolation
place.
in that story
Yeah.
is
And if I can't prove it on paper, I will willing bet, however, that August Derleth was a big fan of the Wendigo, because he later came on with Ithagwa, the big.
Actually, now that you say that, there's a total like psychic link there. Yeah,
August
you're right.
Derleth
That
was
must
never not a fan of something that he could steal.
Right.
Rename.
he actually co-wrote that with
Yeah.
with him. So.
Yeah, I can totally see that.
But as we were talking about the House of the Wolfens, that's kind of less fantasy and more, as one foot in historical fiction, which I know something near and dear to your heart, Howard. So.
Well, it is, and I think the reason that Harold Lamb never made it onto Appendix N was because he wasn't, his great Cossack stories hadn't really been reprinted very much. It was possible to find a few of them, but they weren't widely distributed, and it was never a solid. It's an entire episodic cycle of stories that follows one on the other. It would make a great miniseries.
Yeah, they're great.
But Gary Gygax would not have had access to more than a handful of those because a lot of them had never been reprinted. Well, they've been reprinted now, and unlike some of the other historicals we were talking about, they're really not hard going at all. There's a little bit of an old-fashioned touch to it, but the narrative drive is just so straightforward. And I guess I would say, if you're going to explore Harold Lamb, I start with Wolf of the Steppes. And the first one or two are shorter, and you can just kind of see him getting used to the concept, and then pow, he explodes with these exciting, exotic places and weird environments that are challenging for the heroes. And I think your favorite is the one that siege story around a frozen lake.
It was so good.
Yeah.
So there's like this. This is back in the era when Christianity was new. There's this old Christian, right? He's like 70 years old, has a suit of armor, lives with his granddaughter, I think it is.
Yeah.
In this like tower that's in the middle of a lake, and he's the last defender of Christianity in this zone of the world where I guess the I forget who. The locals are trying to roust him.
Yeah.
And the hero Klit, the Cossack, comes to his defense because I forget the name of the bad guys, but the bad guy tribe, the barbarians, basically have waited until winter, and so this unassailable tower, which is in the middle of a lake, can now be attacked because the lake is frozen. And so they plot this attack across the lake, and the story is just excellent. How this lone, dying, elderly Christian defends his tower, and the best part was where the barbarians are climbing the tower, and the Cossack manages to lift this like giant stone, and he waits till just the right time and hurls it into the ice, and the ice shatters and cracks, and like the barbarian army falls into the icy cold water, as I recall.
Yeah.
Like there's so many like great scenes in that book, in that story.
There's so much cinematic stuff.
Yeah.
There's even a scene, that great bit from Return of the King where Legolas scales the elephant and kills like a million people. My God, there's a scene in one of the Klit the Cossack stories. It's not as big an elephant. It's a regular-sized elephant. But the Mongolian warrior scales the elephant, kills everyone on top, throws the leader down, lands on top of him, cuts off his head, and runs charging at his enemies. I mean, this stuff is awesome.
But there's another one. Remember when he's trying to plot. There's this caravan of the bad guys. I forget who they're walking, marching to somewhere. And the Cossack is like looking after them and plotting out his attack. And remember the ambushes that this is probably not appropriate these days, but the caravan has at the end this bull elephant war machine, which is basically like an elephant with a howdah on top, and they shoot arrows. So as I recall, he pours burning oil on the elephant's back, and the elephant then jumps up and bolts and then tramples the rest of the enemies in front of him. And he basically takes out this entire caravan with like boiling oil and one sword,
and an elephant.
And an elephant. It's their elephant. He uses like their elephant.
Don't
leave that out of our crucial plan.
But it's like a lot of it is about this aging warrior. He's the oldest warrior around because he's like 45 or something.
I think he's like 60.
Maybe 60.
He's ancient by their standards. So he's still a decent swordsman, but he doesn't have as much endurance anymore. So he has to live by his wits.
Yes.
And he's really cunning. You have to be that smart to survive as a Cossack into your 60s. Right?
He's extremely. And he also has really long mustaches.
Yeah.
Like every description they describe how his mustache goes down to like his waist or something.
Is that where we get that in DCC? Is that where we get the magic mustaches?
Anyway, it's great stuff. The first one's called The Wolf of the Steppes, and I think it's got like 10 or 11 stories in it, and highly recommended.
Yeah.
So he did some Cossack stories. He also did some Crusade stories.
Oh yeah, sure. So,
if somebody's looking for less like stepped action, but
if they're looking for less step action, check out Swords from the West, which is a collection of most of his Crusader stuff. And unlike you think, Crusaders always set in the Middle Ages, in the Middle East, along the Holy Land. Outremer is what the French called it. Most of the time, since he was fascinated with the Far East or the Nearish East, the Mongolian East, his Crusaders almost always ended up tangling with the Mongolians, or Tamerlane, or something wild like that. So you're going into these areas and these regions that we don't normally see as Western readers in our history covered in very much detail. So it's really fascinating world building, and he's really good with bringing an environment to life, like a weird desert or a strange mountain pass, and it is historical fiction. There's occasional hints that maybe there was supernatural involved. It's usually explained away, but it's not it was really Mr. McGee under the mask.
The elephant pulls off a mask and realizes it's six guys.
Old Witherspoon.
It's never like that. Like a bunch of people die because they've been going to this tomb. No one ever comes out. Well, it comes out. There's a poisonous gas inside, right? And they think it's cursed. Well, it is cursed in a way, but it's not actually magic.
Right.
Yeah.
Cursed with poisonous gas.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I hear historical fiction, honestly, I think it's boring. Just to say it, these are not boring at all. It is terrific fantasy, just without the fantasticalness, but it really feels like amazing action, and there's always that hint of supernatural that gets you engaged.
That hint of could it be or could it not be supernatural?
Yeah.
I'm currently reading The Black Diamonds by Clark Ashton Smith. He wrote it when he was 14 years old. It's 90,000 words, and it wasn't published till 2007. And through the entire book, it's, you know, there are the magicians, and they're like, well, see, so the way we do this is we use a black backdrop and a guy dressed in black, and he makes the things appear for us. There's no real supernatural, and the stuff that feels that way, well, maybe it's just the forces of nature. And so it's a much more grounded sort of story than you would expect from him. And that is it or isn't it feel is really fun.
Yeah.
That's cool. Do we want to talk Sabatini?
I mean, you know, actually, he's an author that I'm not all that familiar with, so I know personally I would love to hear more about it.
So Sabatini wrote a whole bunch of stuff, and what you normally
Was he just known as Sabatini, like Cher, or did he have another name too?
Raphael Sabatini.
just in case people are trying to find him at home or
Sabatini.
something.
He sounds like a Vegas magician.
I've known a few.
Well, he's probably most famous for Seahawk and Captain Blood, and of the two, I vastly prefer Captain Blood, honestly. Seahawk has some cool moments, but it kind of reads like a stage play where the characters come on and tell you about all the action that happened over here. Whereas Captain Blood throws you into the middle of the cool pirate action. And it's a really good read. I mean, it's slightly old-fashioned style, but it's good old-fashioned. You just get sucked right in, and you just kick back, and you're reading about Captain Blood and his travails. And there's also 2 follow-up books of short stories, and the short stories are also quite excellent. Although there's one terrible one that is so incredibly racist. It's like a turd in the punch bowl.
That's
So Captain Blood escapes slavery, and he frees a whole bunch of pirates to help him escape slavery. But there's one time where these slavers come to ask him for help, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I'll help you get your cargo back." And he goes and he helps them recapture the slaves. It's so dreadful. But the rest of them are just awesome little stories where sometimes there's swashbuckling, sometimes he triumphed by his wits. You never know when you start one of the Sabatini short stories what kind of story you're going to get. There's a great variety in them. But if you're just going to try one, try Captain Blood, the novel. And if you groove on that, then there's like 2 small paperbacks full of additional adventures that you can read about him.
Can I borrow your pen? I gotta
Yeah.
write that down.
If you don't groove on Captain Blood, you don't like pirate stories at all.
I'm familiar with the movies that they adapt. I didn't realize that they were originally based on, of course.
And as always, the book is much better.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, it's actually Captain Blood is a fix-up novel based on a series of novellas like Appeared in Adventure, but it's pretty seamless. You can't. A lot of times, a fixed-up novel, you can kind of tell, this is just sort of jammed together.
Oh, look, a bridging narration.
Yeah, but it's good stuff.
It's like that was it the round robin that Lovecraft and Howard and their 2 other.
Oh, that's dreadful because some of the writers really try to play off of each other, and then some of them don't. They're like, yeah, the stuff that you set up, no, all those people are dead. I'm just going to tell something new.
You can't premise reject the plot of the round robin.
It's like a gore kidslayer.
Right.
So there's a couple of writers from that it's fun to read, but mostly it's a waste. It's a waste of energy because it's so frustrating. So those are my recommendations for Sabatini. I know you like Scaramouche quite well.
Well, my favorite is definitely Captain Blood. I mean, pirates. I don't know if anybody knows me here, but pirates is sort of my thing, and all of his pirate stories are good, but Captain Blood is brilliant for the imagery, for the feel. I wouldn't say necessarily for the accuracy, but it sets such a tone. It is the quintessential maritime adventure story that authors that have followed, whether it be just straight naval fiction or pirate fiction, have aspired to and tried to duplicate. The Aubrey Moritang stories are great for naval fiction, and they capture some of the same imagery later with the battles and shipboard life, but Sabatini's imagery in everything he writes can't be, you can't overstate it. The depth of character, some of the interesting side characters that slide in and out are wonderful.
He wrote an awful lot of material. He was incredibly popular and successful during his lifetime, so there's an awful lot of Sabatini. The problem is a lot of it is sort of mannered, where the chief part of the plot is keeping the hero and the heroine separate and wondering whether or not they'll actually get together. And if you read a number of them in a row, you get tired. Oh, this is just the same story with different plots. Captain Blood maybe has a little bit of that, but it's more involved. Now, I haven't explored everything in his vast canon, so I'm sure that there are some that aren't. I have heard very good things about his stories of Casanova. He had like a short story series about Casanova, the Great Lover. But of course, this is from the early 19th century, so you're not going to get a whole lot of hot X-rated action out of these. It's going to be very chaste, so there's going to be swashbuckling and maybe a kiss or two. And
You get some guy comes on, tells about all the hot action that occurred offhand.
Yeah,
You should have been there. That's it.
So I can't verify that they're good, but I've been meaning to explore them. They might be worth a look if you enjoy Captain Blood.
And he's very approachable.
Yeah.
His stuff it's an easy point of entry. It's not a difficult read. I mean, it's not Shakespeare. It is the pulp of its time. It really is, and it's a fun read.
Anything called Captain Blood. It's gotta be approachable.
What do you think? What do you say?
If we put that in a manuscript, Joe, I know I would reject it. It's a little bit too much on the nose there.
Think a little harder.
Yeah, right. Captain Gore, come on. All right, there we go. That's it. It's not so much on the nose. Right?
Captain Death.
And as long as we're talking about the historicals, I'm going to throw one more out there, and this is Arthur D. Howden Smith. He's not that famous anymore, but there were two things he did for Adventure magazine back in the day. One of them was a very long-running series that's unfortunately still out of print about the Viking Swain. A small press publisher may be bringing those back into print, but let's not go into detail since they're hard to find. The Grey Maiden stories are in print, and Grey Maiden, unlike a lot of these historicals, there is a hint of fantastic in these. It's a series of interconnected short stories about this fabulous sword forged from a meteorite for a pharaoh, and it's handed down, and whoever bears Grey Maiden, this great sword, cannot be killed by a blade. It's just this fantastically sharp sword. So long as they wield the blade, they cannot be killed by a blade. And so it's a series of stories about what happens to the blade with each person who ends up with it. So there's an Egyptian story about its forging. It's called The Forging. There's a story about the Romans that get a hold of it. There's a story about an Arabian that gets a hold of it. There's a story about a Viking that gets a hold of it, and that's actually one of the most awesome ones of all. And they've been reprinted by Altus Press, and I think it's just called Grey Maiden.
Okay.
And it's the first complete printing because, of course, people reprinted it in the past but didn't bother putting all the stories in. It's like, what was wrong with you people? They would leave out the origin story or
You don't need to know that.
yeah, I don't need how it happened. And those are really cool. That's the Grey Maiden cycle from Altus Press. And then there was a sort of a lost classic. He had a 6-part series. So it was reprinted in 6 parts over the course of 6 obscure pulp magazines. Good luck trying to track all those down. It was never reprinted. Well, now Altus Press has reprinted it, and that's called He Rules Who Can. And
That just screams like Robert E. Howard.
Right.
Well, it's awesome. It's about a Viking who goes to Constantinople and becomes the head of the bodyguard for the scheming Empress Irene.
Skeevy.
The scheming, it is awesome. There's plot and counterplot, and of course the Viking is actually Harold Hardrada, who later becomes king of Denmark and then dies trying to become king of England, right? And it's pretty closely based on what's supposed to have happened to him, because we have the historical records. It is, strange exotic cultures clashing, plot and counterplot, treachery and intrigue, great sea battles, It is hard to put down. It was fabulous. I'm so glad that more people now have a chance to read it. And again, that's He Rules Who Can, and that's from Altus Press.
Was what time period was it? Would he been like contemporary with Robert E. Howard, or was he like
He
more
would
like
have been
the-
slightly before Howard would have been reading him.
That's what I get the impression of. It
Right.
was just, okay, all right.
Right. So he would have been like 1920s when he was doing his stuff. I think he finished doing most of his fiction by the time Howard started
Okay,
doing his
so-
fiction.
so.
Right. He became a very well-known translator of Norse work. And he was a professor.
Okay.
I forget what institution.
Yeah,
I'm
it
sorry.
kind of sounds like something that I thought that this was, I don't know if you, and I know you were, you are the man when it comes to Howard, but if this is, do we have any evidence that this, like, Howard was aware of him and would have read him?
Well, he became a huge fan of Adventure Magazine, and once he became aware of it, he picked up every issue he could. So we know, for instance, that he was reading Harold Lamb because he even wrote a poem titled to the character
Okay.
yeah, right, and God, I can't remember the Robert E. Howard scholar. I'm tired.
That's okay.
But he sent me a list. Yeah.
Glenn Lord?
No, it wasn't Glenn. I met Glenn Lord once, late in his life. But no, this was one I corresponded with. He sent me a list of vocabulary terms he'd found in Howard's papers. He said, hey, do you think I think these might have come from some Harold Lamb stories. Do you know what these are from? And by God, so I had scanned all these Harold Lamb stories prior to them getting in the collection, so it was very easy for me to search. What it turns out he'd done is gone through like a stack of Harold Lamb stories and written down all these foreign terms and defined them based on the Harold Lamb stories, and you could find them in order appearing in the Harold Lamb stories. And you could even see from the order of the words which story he'd had on top. It's like, okay, he read this one, then he read this one. Yeah, and none of those are the Cossack stories, so I don't know if he was reading those, but he definitely was reading some of the later
Okay.
stuff. Yeah.
When you said the Adventure Magazine, I wasn't quite sure if we were talking about like the pulps with like the the sweats later on, which was that,
well,
so that,
yeah, no.
Yeah, okay.
So Adventure Magazine was one of the great pulps. It was even respected by Newsweek. I think they called it the dean of the pulps. It was well known for being a source of great historical accuracy. So that and Argosy were probably the top swashbuckling pulps that you could lay hands on. Sometimes, for a long time, it was twice a month, sometimes 3 times a month. You'd get a big honkin' magazine, just adventures from all eras, swashbucklers, pirates, Cossacks, French Foreign Legion stories. It was a one-stop shop for adventure, hence the name.
So, all right, so leaving Captain Blood behind, I think it's time for the lighter side of things. And I think, Bob, you had something
yeah,
to talk about that.
There comes a point where there comes a point before Appendix N when you're first starting to get into fantasy. For a lot of people, it was like the Narnia stories or things of that nature, and they're great and they're fun, but there's things that help you develop that taste. And while some of them are technically more geared for children or more marketed for children, some of them are great. And I brought props. So there is Lloyd Alexander wrote a series, The Chronicles of Pride. Look at all these nodding heads, see? And they're based on Welsh mythology. We'll ignore the very bad movie. And it's one story from beginning to end with Turan the pig keeper, the assistant pig keeper. So he starts as a 0 level. He has an oracular pig. He gets lost in the forest, and bad things start to happen. And through this, through the story, you begin. There's the bards and the bard at college, and the sort of outcast bard who has the harp that the strings break when he lies.
Flute of Phlegm, right?
Yes, Flute of Phlegm, and you've got I think that's how it's pronounced. It's based on Welsh. I'll do what I can.
Oh yeah, there's no hope.
There's Awani, the princess, who has a gigantic cat whose aunt has been locking her away because she's an evil sorceress in the service of Iran, of Nuban, who's like the Dark Lord of Death. And there's the Battles of the Horned King, the Welsh Cauldron of the Dead, where the corpses are thrown in to rise as the cauldron born and pour forth. And it moves from piece to piece, and there's some surprisingly dark concepts in here. In the fourth book, Tehran Wanderer, he's going through the forest and finds this little sliver of bone hidden in a tree, and it turns out the evil wizard who captures him has bound his soul into that bone. And by snapping that, he kills him and moves forward. And so there's this beautiful bit of world building. And it comes down to, it leads you up to this big battle in the High King, which is really still fantastic. And there's tragedy in there that is not, it's not written for children, it's marketed to them. And you see these characters that you fall in love with, and you see the tragedy that's befalling them, the hard choices they're making, and certainly, no spoiler, they do win. But much like the elves moving on, the Sons of Dawn move on to the Summerlands. And so there's so many concepts that are similar that when you move on to these bigger works, it's not that they feel copied from one another, but they're familiar. There's that sense of familiarity to them. And it's a great entry point. And then if you want to get complicated, my next set of handouts, Neil Hancock. He wrote 2 series. The first one is the one that I recommend, which is called Circle of Light. It's a 4-book series, and it's slightly lighter than The Lord of the Rings, but not by much. And instead of a fellowship of elves and dwarves and men and hobbits, you have an otter, a bear, and a dwarf. So
They walk in the bar.
and they start out as they're anthropomorphic forest creatures, and so they talk back and forth. The dwarf, not really a popular guy, and then there is the overarching wizard who comes to them because the Dark Lord is on the move. Now this is definitely inspired by Tolkien. This came out in the early 80s.
Oh, okay.
And so you can see, you can see Tolkien's fingerprints are all over it, just like mine.
I believe those were called the Toll clones.
The Toll clones, yes. You squint really hard. But they're wonderful stories, and despite the fact that, it's an otter, a bear, and not a Tolkien dwarf, they're written with a real depth. So the otter's not just a cute little animal. The bear's not just a big, grumpy, dumb animal. There's the traits from the animals in them, but the overall story, there's so much pathos, there's so much epic fantasy to it that it's really easy to forget that you look at the cover and there's a woman and an otter lying in a bed, which is kind of a weird thing to see. Once you get past the marketing for it, they're really serious pieces. And for me, reading both of these led to me reading all sorts of things, from Howard to Asimov to Niven to Burroughs. These were my gateway into Appendix N, and they still hold up today.
All right. That's cool. I've never heard of that one.
Yeah, me too.
There was something I meant to say about Lamb, and let me circle back to that real quick before we move on, and that was that there's actually been some articles on the Goodman Games website about how to use Lamb in your fiction, right? What was that article called?
I don't remember, but I
How do you use Lamb in your fiction?
Yeah. I think
Might
it
have
was.
been that.
I think it was like plundering the Clint the Cossack stories. And how to use them? Yeah.
Yeah. I also have to say, you mentioned Clark Ashton Smith. I think he's probably one of the more well-known members of almost Appendix N, so we probably don't have to go into him, but his work's amazing, and there's so much of it.
Well, and part of the Lovecraft circle, and
Yeah.
Yeah, he's the one that everybody assumes is on Appendix N until you look at it and you realize, how is Clark Ashton Smith not on this? And then, again, it was one of those situations like Gary had what I know he was introduced to Clark Ashton Smith later.
Yeah.
Because I know Rob Kuntz was a big fan of him. But I guess it just, the timeline just didn't, overlap to the point it was. But yeah, his stuff is just, you know, out of the weird three, the Three Musketeers, like the weird fiction between,
He's
you
the
know, Howard
weirdest,
and him.
yeah.
He was like the most well-adjusted, I guess, you know. There's a tremendous documentary that's out there. It's called the Emperor of Dreams, and it's about a half hour too long, but other than that, it's one of those. But it's really goes into Clark Ashton Smith's life, and it interviews a lot of contemporary artists and writers who were inspired by him. Harlan Ellison shows up, and Harlan Ellison is kind of mellowed by age, apparently. I was like, this is not the Harlan Ellison I know. So.
He didn't mellow by age, he just liked Clark Ashton Smith.
Yeah, okay,
Harlan
that
Ellison
could be
did
it
not
too.
mellow.
Yeah. So if you have no experience, like I had read all his works, but I didn't know too much about his his personal life. It's like available on Amazon Prime. You can download for $4 or whatever it is. It's definitely worth checking out.
Well, and Joe, you're kind of a big Clark Ashton Smith fan, aren't you? I mean,
Yeah, I can't keep track of all the stories because there's so many, but he's written so much good sci-fi, fantasy, even like borderline historical fantasy. The whole, I'm gonna say it wrong, but Avron, which is just a pseudo France. Like he writes in a lot of genres, and it's really, really good.
Horror and
I also like the fact his vocabulary is incredible. So him and Jack Vance are the two that, whenever I read a book, I write on the inside cover all the words that I don't know, so I remember them and look them up. And like most books, there's, I don't know, 5 or 10 words I don't know, but Clark Ashton Smith, like every book is like 50 words I don't know.
but so Clark Ashton Smith, you're writing on the inside cover of a different book.
Right? Yeah, he's such an incredible vocabulary, and he uses words so cleverly.
Didn't he famously self-educate himself by reading an entire set of encyclopedias?
I believe that's right. Yeah.
And he got his beginning as a poet. So he was the poet of Auburn, and that's what he was known as. And his I forget the name of his mentor, but his mentor was like one of the new not like the new romantics, but at the time. And there was a lot of discussion as that like Clark Ashton Smith might have gone to be like poet laureate of the United States, except for the fact that his parents got sick, and then he as is the case which has happened with more than a few of the old writers, that he had to support the parents, and what's the cheapest job you can get if you're a wordsmith is writing for the pulps.
Well, yeah, I mean, in some circles, he was definitely more well known for his poetry than for his fiction.